And now I'd like to invite John and Judy to talk about Dear Dorothy.
Good evening, everyone. I first met Dorothy over 50 years ago in 1967. She was a beautiful, light-filled being with sparkling eyes. And in the early days, she was very much aware of what was happening because she'd been very thoroughly trained by Sheena, as had Peter and Eileen for many years. She often claimed that Findhorn really began in 1952, and there was a 10-year gestation period before they arrived here at Findhorn. And early in their time in the caravan, she lived in the annex of the original caravan, very small space. Within the first 18 months, she started connecting with the Davic world. And the first Deva was the garden pea, which was her favourite vegetable. And she got many messages. One of them was to encourage humans to be grateful for the food they ate, not just take it for granted. She got messages to help Peter with the gardening. And the garden flourished. There really were big cabbages when I showed up. And we ate mostly from the garden that had been created over those first 3 years. Dorothy was the first beekeeper here at Findhorn. Jonathan and I used to watch in awe as she cared for the bees and extracted the honey. And she always wore a little bee in her lapel. And he and I have continued this practice ever since. They're a very important part of the early days of Findhorn, as were the worms, the first workers. Dorothy was quite a shy person in the early days when I knew her. She wouldn't talk to more than 2 or 3 people at a time. And it wasn't till she moved to North America with what became the Lorien Group that I think, particularly with David and Myrtle, they drew her out, and eventually, as we all know, she became a global teacher and shared her stories for decades, well into her 80s. She came back to Findhorn in 2009 and had work to complete. And I was privileged to be one of her carers, and we used to have many adventures together. I remember one afternoon we ended up in a cafe along the coast, Fochabers, and as we came out, we met an elderly gentleman, and they stopped and looked at each other. And when Dorothy was the receptionist at Cluny Hill, way back in the late 50s, the hotel was closed in the winter from October through to Easter. So she took a winter job, and she was the secretary to Gordon Baxter, who headed Baxter Foods. And then they lost touch, and they reconnected after this 50-plus years, and it was like a reunion of brother and sister. It was a very beautiful thing to behold. He invited us for a lunch, and we had he and his wife over for afternoon tea, and yeah, he'd really appreciated the time that she'd worked for him. To me, Dorothy embodied the light and the love, which to me was wisdom. She loved to be in nature. We spent a lot of time listening to the waves, walking along the river, being in the trees. And yeah, I want to thank you, Dorothy, for your mentoringship and your love. We connect each morning when I'm on the beach, and it's a very special time for me. Judy.
Thanks, John. I didn't know Dorothy nearly as long as John did. When I arrived in the community, they had just celebrated their 15th birthday. And so Dorothy was somebody that I heard stories about because she had already left. And starting in the 90s, she started coming back and doing workshops, and she would meet with various groups and stuff. And I started asking her when we were going to get her biography of Findhorn, because we had Peter's and we had Eileen's. And every year she would say, I'm working on it. And after nearly a decade, one day, I think to sort of shut me up and get me to stop asking, she looked at me and she said, when you come and help me write it. What she didn't know is that I had a sabbatical period coming up. So I just looked at her and said, okay, name the date. And that's kind of how it really began for her and I. And a little bit like Liza, as we worked on the book, I discovered underneath her desk this pile of papers and old file folders and folders full of old transparency rice paper that were carbon copies of typewritten messages. And when I asked her what it was, she said, oh, that's just the old guidance. And I asked her permission to read it. And she couldn't, she was a bit like, what? Why would you want to do that? But she said yes. So just as Liza did with Eileen, I had the opportunity to just read about 50 years of guidance, just a few pages every day. And I started asking her questions about, well, what was this about? And what was that about? And she didn't think people would be interested in how she felt or thought about the things that she had lived through. And she kept saying, people aren't going to be interested in that and that and that. So it took a while to convince her to write some of the stories that in the end she did. For me, she was the epitome of dedication and commitment and integrity. And she used to talk about how those early days for her were an experiment in living life with God at the center. If you put spirit in the center of your life in all things, then what happens? And very interesting things happened. But what I most loved about her, there were two things I particularly respected. One was her sense of humor. She had an absolutely wicked sense of humor, and her ability to turn a pun or make a wry comment was just par excellence. And I think it's a part of her that not necessarily people really got the privilege or honor of seeing. And the other thing was her courage, because as John said, she was an extremely shy person. She actually told me a story once of literally having to be carried off a stage because she literally froze in a debate. She was part of a debating team and she just literally froze and had to be carried off. So wanting to be a public speaker was never anything she planned on, but it was another example of a place where she was asked to do something, and so she took it up and became a teacher and traveled. I want to tell a story that embodies a different kind of courage. She and I were invited, she was invited to go to Thailand. She was like 84 years old at that point. And we'd been traveling for about 3 or 4 weeks, and were invited to this little center down in the south. And it was quite a trek, and we walked through a rubber plantation, and we finally got there. And we were told there was a river that we needed to cross, but there was a bridge. And we got there, and the river was about the width of the hall there, and the bridge consisted of 2 trunks, about that big. Dorothy paled. The organizer noticed that she paled and said, oh, well, there's another way that we can get there, but, we'll have to go back to the car and drive and da-da-da-da-da. So off we went, because Dorothy was not going to cross this bridge. One of the other things people don't know a lot about her is that she didn't really like heights very much. The road was washed out, so we had to come back to the bridge. And Dorothy took a deep breath and she said, no, we'll walk across the river. So she and I waded across the river. It never got higher than about, chest deep, waded across. And the people on the other side were just like beside themselves because there was this 85-year-old lady who was walking through the river. We stayed there that night and it poured with rain. The whole night it poured. And the next morning our organizer said, I think you're going to have to leave. This isn't going to work, this particular location, because by that time it got very muddy and da-da-da-da. So that meant we had to go across the bridge again. And they said, you're going to have to go across the bridge, Dorothy, because the river has come way, way up and there's no way we can, walk across it. It was an interesting next 15 or 20 minutes while she geared herself up. We got there and they had put a rope at least above the two poles. And when we stood, she just stood there and these two very handsome, strapping men offered to assist her, at which point her eyes lit up. She was very appreciative of male beauty, actually, in her lifetime. And so she, they each took one in front and one behind, and she shuffled across these two logs, hanging on to the wood for dear life, the rope, got to the other side and kind of peeled her fingers off the rope and came to the other side. And for me, that for me was an absolute epitome of the kind of courage that she demonstrated her whole life on all levels. The courage to just do what needed to be done, to follow that inner direction, because she'd said yes to doing this traveling, so she would say yes to whatever else we had to do. So, I miss her a lot. Okay.